Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second day of the conference on ESG for banks, corporates, and institutional investors. Today, we're going to have the second day. This conference is co-organized by the Institute of Finance and Financial Regulation and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. I hope you enjoyed the first day. The second day is going to be very insightful as well. We're thrilled to have more than 1,200 delegates registered from all over the world. So good morning to US, good afternoon to Europe and Northern Africa, and good evening to Asia and Australia. Without further delay, may I pass the floor to Professor Gikas Hardouvelis, who is going to chair the next session. Gikas is independent non-executive member of the board of directors of the National Bank of Greece. He is also a professor in the Department of Banking and Financial Management of the University of Piraeus and a distinguished IFFR fellow. He has served as a former Minister of Finance, as well as director of two prime ministers, of the Economic Office of two prime ministers. He has also served as a chief economist for two leading Greek banks, MBG and Eurobank. He has a rich academic career serving in Columbia University and Rutgers. He has also spent quite some time in New York Fed. He has published in all top finance and economic journals, and he holds a PhD from Berkeley University and a first degree from Harvard. So Gikas, we're thrilled to have you with us. Over to you.
Thank you, George. I will be presiding over this session, which is named called Institutional Investors, Climate Risks, and EU Regulation. And we have three very distinguished speakers for the session. I'm going to introduce them one by one. After I introduce them, they'll have about 15 minutes, they'll speak, and then we'll go to the next speaker. And we will start with George himself, the head of IFFR. George is a professor at the University of Piraeus here in Greece, and also at Queen Mary University in London. George is a very distinguished academic, with an interest and an expertise in asset pricing, in commodities, in financial derivatives, in risk management, portfolio management. And he has published in top finance journals like Management Science, JFQA, Journal of Business and Economic Statistics, and many more journals. What's special about George's work is that it has an impact, that practitioners listen to it, they follow his advice. In fact, one of his papers was in the top 25 most cited papers in the Journal of Banking and Finance. And George, I guess, will be the first speaker today. I assume he will talk about institutional investors and ESG. George, the podium is to you. And let me remind our audience that they can pose their questions, and to the speaker they want, there's a choice there in front of their screen, and they can do it. And we will have a question-answer session right after the speakers finish with their presentations. And also the speakers themselves may want to ask each other after we're done. So go ahead, George.
Thank you very much, Gikas. Please feel free to interrupt me very rudely 3 minutes before the end of my talk, so that I know that I'm respecting time. So let me share the screen with you. I guess you can see this. Okay, great. So my talk is going to focus on three areas, if you like. The first area has to do with defining the types of climate risks we're talking about, and how these may redefine practices. I have a question mark because I'm going to come back to this at the end of the talk. Then we're going to talk about what do institutional investors respond regarding climate risks and how they take them into account in their investment decisions. And finally, what do actually the market tells us about whether investors take institutional climate risks into account. So in general, when we're talking about climate change risks, we classify them in two broad categories. One has to do with direct risks, and in this category we have the so-called physical risks, like hurricanes, rise of sea levels, wildfires, and typically these are long-run risks. And then we have indirect climate change risks, which are called transition risks, emanating from the transition to a low-carbon economy. And these include risks stemming from changes in technology and regulatory risks. And these have imminent effects, and therefore they're considered to be short-run risks. Now, the measurement of climate change risks is not trivial at all. Yesterday, Anna Murray and Gabriel Karageorgiou pointed to that. It is probably the most quantitative aspect of the three dimensions of ESG. And this, of course, poses challenges for adopting E criteria, and therefore expertise is required. So let's see whether climate risks redefine practices, and they seem initially to do so in the investment industry and academia. So here is a quote from Larry Fink, the chairman and CEO of BlackRock, which is the giant in this index investing field with an AUM of about 9 trillion. So in his letter to the CEOs in 2020, Fink said that we're on the edge of fundamental reshaping of finance, and he brought forward a change in the principles and guidelines of BlackRock with respect to investing in sustainable companies. At the same time, we have initiatives like the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investing, where the number of signatories and the AUM has increased quite a lot from inception up to, say, here with data from 2020. And in academia, similarly, we experience a new strand, which is nowadays called climate finance. It's really amazing how fast academic papers and research appear in this new strand. So how do institutional investors respond to the question on whether they take climate risks into account? And I'm going to rely here on a recent survey by Kruger, Sautner, and Starks, which was published in the Review of Financial Studies, which is one of the top 3 finance journals. The acceptance rate in this kind of journal is about 4%, and the articles that appear there are really credible. So the demographics of this survey include 48 respondents from institutions with more than 100 billion AUM. These are portfolio managers and C-class executives. We have pension funds, banks, and mutual funds in this pool. 38% have long investment horizons, 32% of them are headquartered in US, and they invest 47% of their AUMs in equities, and 38% is passively invested. Climate risk, the way that this survey is structured, climate risk means here physical risks in the sense of an increase of temperature relative to the target of the Paris 2015 agreement, which is 2 degrees Celsius relative to the pre-industrial levels. Some of the key findings regarding the majority of respondents include the fact that investors deem climate risks not to be the most important types of risks. They deem financial risks to be the most important types of risks. They find them hard to measure. As expected, the passive and long-term investors are concerned the most because, as we said, physical risks have long-term effects. Regarding the way that they manage the risk, basically most of them analyze the carbon footprint of firms in their portfolio. And in terms of engagement, they are holding discussions with the top management. So why do they take climate risks into account in portfolio decisions? According to their responses, this is because of financial and non-financial reasons, like regulatory pressure, peers pressure, doing well by doing good, preferences of their clients and their own preferences, and performance. However, three seem to be the strongest motives: the protection of the investors' reputations, their moral ethical considerations, and their legal and fiduciary duties. So this is what institutional investors tell us. How about stock prices? What do they tell us? Well, do stock prices reflect climate risks? Well, the answer is not obvious, as we will see. If not, then this poses a threat for financial stability in the same way that risks in mortgages in US were not priced, and this led to the great financial crisis we experienced in 2008. And as a result, this is why this makes policymakers really nervous. So if stock prices do not reflect climate risks, then policymakers should intervene. Regarding people who say, well, yes, stock prices do reflect climate risks, this is plausible because climate change risks may have imminent effects if they're incorporated in legislation. On the other hand, people may say, no, they do not. Why? Because physical risks are long run, and investors may not pay attention to them. Like Vasiliki Lazarakou said yesterday, that in terms of regulation, regulators are concerned that investors may be short-termist. Second, the effects of transition risks may not be easy to identify. These may depend on government's intervention, on the tastes of consumers, and the education of investors, as a recent CFA report has revealed. Third, divestment. People keep talking about portfolio decarbonization. However, if you talk to pension funds, for instance, divestment is costly. Why? Because typically long-term investors hold illiquid assets, so it's costly to liquidate them. At the same time, these investors invest via ETFs. So if they want to decarbonize their portfolio, they have to sell the entire ETF, which includes the brown firms, and buy a new ETF, which includes green firms. And at the same time, the monitoring in terms of the ESG performance of firms is very costly. Last but not least, the risk-return profile of the investment may be harmed once you decarbonize. There is a very nice paper by Peterson and co-authors. So Peterson, you may know he's in AQR. So basically, he shows in the paper that under certain conditions, decarbonization may harm the risk-return profile. In fact, Peterson generalizes the well-known Markowitz setting, the mean variance setting, by adding a third dimension, the ESG dimension, and he has an ESG frontier. So given that this is an open question, with colleagues from the Central Bank of Denmark, for the first time we explored this question, and I'm going to show to you in layman terms in the remaining, how many minutes, Gikas?
7 minutes.
7 minutes, thank you.
Max.
We're going to provide you first-time evidence regarding the question whether market-wide climate risks are reflected in stock prices. What we're doing in this research, and by the way, this research does not reflect the opinions of the Central Bank of Denmark, we construct novel aggregate climate risks. How do we do this? Yesterday, Anna Murray and Gabriel Karageorgiou referred to machine learning. So in fact, we use advances in machine learning and big data using textual analysis, a quite advanced method called latent Dirichlet allocation. We applied that to Reuters News. Over the period 2018, we have about 13 million articles there. And by articles, you can think of articles ranging from 40 words up to about 300 words. We looked for climate change and global warming in these articles, and we ended up with 34,000 articles. What is the beauty of LDA? LDA breaks the corpus in categories. So intuitively thinking, if you are a reader and you are reading an article, your brain works in a way so that you split the article you are reading into categories. So LDA delivers the so-called topics, which you can think of as bugs, including words, and then the user, depending on the frequency of words which appear in each bug, labels them. And we're lucky enough that we can label 4 topics which have a clear interpretation. So these are our risk factors. This is how we dissect climate risks. The first 2 are the physical risks, natural disasters and global warming. The other 2 have to do with policy. So these are international summits related to climate change and US climate policy. Now, as you will see, the factor magnitude is something very intuitive. It shows the attention that each topic receives by media on any given date. What we find out of this research is that only the last topic, the US climate policy, is priced. And at the very end, I'm going to comment on the implications. So here is very quickly to enable you to visualize what we're talking about. You see the so-called word clouds. So for instance, in this topic, you can see that the words which appear bigger in bigger fonts are the ones which come up more frequently. So this topic talks about weather, disasters, storm, drought. So it has to do with natural disasters, physical disasters. The second topic here has to do with fossil average century degrees temperature. So it has to do with global warming. The third factor refers to names where international summits took place. Regarding the US climate policy, we have topics which refer to state level. So here, for instance, you see legislation, California, nuclear, and the topic to the right, the category to the right, refers to US climate policy referring to the federal level, like Clinton, Republican campaign house, and so on and so forth. Just, I guess I must have about 4 minutes now, 3, something like that.
Yeah.
Here you see how our factors look like. So for instance, the natural disasters factor spikes up whenever something, is happening in the world regarding natural disasters. So you see wildfires in California, East India flood, and so on and so forth. The second one spikes up whenever you have news about global warming. The third one spikes up whenever you have international summits. And the fourth one is the US climate policy textual factor. So here you have news related to climate, like bills which may pass through the House of Representatives, the BP oil spill, US abandoning the Paris Agreement, the nomination of Scott Pruitt, a notorious anti-environmentalist in the Energy Protection Agency, and so on and so forth. What we find, as we said, is that only the US climate policy factor is priced. So here what I'm showing to you is the alpha of the spread portfolio that we construct, where we go long by buying stocks which have a negative, by buying stocks which have a positive textual climate beta, and we go short in stocks which have a negative climate textual beta. This is a hedging story we bring forward. In the interest of time, I may explain later. But what this figure clearly shows is that only the US climate policy factor is priced. So to conclude, what are the lessons for stakeholders? So in terms of our research and the survey that I showed to you, our research provides novel measures of market-wide climate risks. We find that climate risks are priced only when they reach the political arena. What are the implications? Policymakers and regulators need to step in. How can they do this? They can do this either via taxing brown firms and making the disclosure of information from firms compulsory, as we discussed yesterday, or by increasing the awareness of the public. Very interestingly, the stock market cannot substitute regulation to combat climate externalities. And I'm closing this with two very interesting statements. This is a very recent statement by Larry Fink, the CEO, as we said, of BlackRock. He says, I prefer capitalists self-regulate when it comes to climate change risks. And then here is the response from his former employee. So Tariq Fancy has been the former chief investment officer of BlackRock. He's not working there any longer. And what Tariq says is, if I was on a panel and someone asked me, what's the best way to tackle climate change? Should I buy an ETF or should I call my congressperson and demand legislation and a price on carbon? The truth is, someone is better off calling their congressperson. So Fancy basically argues that by, moving away from the stocks of brown firms doesn't really punish them. Why? Because somebody else is going to buy these stocks. The operations of the firms are not going to fundamentally change. This action is very different from boycotting the firm where you stop buying the product. The firm is still going to be there. And actually, our results from our research speak very much towards Tariq Fancy's view. That's all I had to say. Thank you very much for your attention.
We already had a professor and someone, Claudia, from the private sector. And now we will have a different expert, Ms. Astrid Leiderfood. It's a bit hard to pronounce her last name. She comes from the European Commission. Well, I don't know if I said it right. She's the head of Unit F1 of the Directorate General for Environment and Sustainable Development in the European Commission. And her unit works on developing environment at the European Commission. Her unit works in developing environmental strategy through the implementation of the European Green Deal and providing input for future orientations. The unit promotes implementation of the UN Sustainable Development Goals in the EU and globally, and ensures coordination of environmental issues in G7 and G20. I'd be interested to hear whether she sees any differences between the G7 and G20, whether there are political frictions among the two. Anyway, she has more than 20 years of professional experience working on these topics, and we're very happy she's here with us to share her view about what is going on. We know environment has become a hot topic with it's a public good, and everybody uses it without taking care of it. Let's see what the European Commission has to say. Please, Astrid.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the kind words. Despite all this experience, I'm seeing that I'm facing, as always, these technical problems, because it claims that my presentation is now security. So I can only show it basically, but I hope you can still see it.
We see the.
But you cannot see it in full screen, right?
We can still read. Okay, you can.
I think it's better now.
Now it's full screen. Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much for the kind words, and I'm really delighted to be here. I think it's a very timely conference on a very important topic, and there's a lot going on this topic, both internationally, not least in the G7 and G20, but at the EU level, it's a very active area of development. So I'm delighted to be here to talk a bit about what we've been doing at the EU policy level and what we are planning to do. I want to start by saying that I really come at this from the environmental policy angle, and I think it's very clear that with all these environmental challenges that society is facing, we need to bring the best brains and all parts of society together to deal with this. But it's complex, and it's also complex because working on financial markets is very different than working on pollution of air and water and other things. But these communities need to come together and speak. So First of all, I wanted to mention that in 2018, we started with an action plan on sustainable finance. The aim was really to facilitate the reorientation of capital flows towards a more sustainable economy, and doing so by mainstreaming sustainability into risk management and fostering more transparency and long-termism, as previous speakers also have touched upon. Then what happened, of course, as we are all living these days, is the COVID crisis. And for, I would say, a few weeks, there was a lot of discussions about what does Europe do now? We are now seeing this sanitary crisis hit us, and followed by that, naturally, an economic downturn. It was very clear from the discussions between European leaders that they did not want to abandon what we call the European Green Deal, which is the vision that the European Commission has put forward and that has been endorsed by other European leaders, namely that we really need to come out of the crisis in a green way, and we actually will want to use the environmental strategy to help us navigate throughout the economic crisis, because we really consider that there doesn't have to be a trade-off between economic recovery and sustainability. So therefore, we have pushed ahead on the 2018 action plan. The slides are very detailed, and I have been promised by the organizers that participants can receive them afterwards, because I think what I wanted to do was to really give a very complete picture of where we are that I think would be useful, but I'm not going to talk about all of this now, but just to explain that the action plan had broadly 10 bigger actions. And then I will give you a little bit more information about some of those that I think would be really relevant for your discussions here today. So taxonomy, I will come back to that. The taxonomy file is really about developing some sort of common language of how we know whether an economic activity is actually leading us on the right sustainable pathway or not. There are other actions linked to labels, investment products, various financial advice, benchmarks, and so on, as Claudia also mentioned that her company is working on, and also research and ratings, disclosure, and so forth. I will come back also a bit to the corporate sustainability disclosure, because I think this is really an important piece for your discussions today. But these slides, just to show a little bit that a lot is going on, a lot has already been put forward, but more is to come. So the most recent thing we did now in April 2021 from the Commission side was that we put forward a package where we had one piece, which is the first part of this taxonomy. And I will explain that a little bit more in detail. A second important part is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So this is really linked to what they use, the directive called the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, which we have looked at in detail. And we have found that amongst the things that have not worked very well is that some of the data on environmental risks that derived from that directive is not really comparable. So this is one of the ideas behind this new reporting directive, is to really ensure that the data in the future will be comparable. Finally, this April package also had a number of delegated acts that touched about advice and for asset insurers and various procedures. But this I will not go into here because we will run out of time. But so let me talk a little bit about the taxonomy, which is really, I would say, the cornerstone within the sustainable finance actions that we're taking from the Commission side. So the taxonomy, the idea is really to have a classification tool that can help the investors and the companies make informed decisions. And then the question is what type of information is it actually that is needed, and what do we actually mean when we talk about environmental risks? This is one of the things I really also want to spend a little bit more time on, because what we very often see is that when people say environment, the E in ESG, and talk about environmental risks, they basically are only talking about climate change. However, the approach that we have taken at the EU level is a more broad approach and a more systemic one, where we consider that there are a number of environmental risks that society is facing, and that is also important that these are integrated into the way we govern financial markets. So the 6 environmental issues that we're looking at in the objectives in the taxonomy regulations are climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation. And then there's also the issue of sustainable use and protection of water resources. There's also the transition to a circular economy. There's also pollution prevention control and the protection and restoration of biodiversity. And while I think that if one is working on something very different than environmental science related files, this may seem a little overwhelming that all of these topics are relevant. But I think this is where I think it's really important to explain maybe why we think thinking systemic is important. Because fighting climate change and adapting, I mean, by now, I think most people have come to understand why the climate change is posing a risk to all of us. And of course, many people also understand that if the climate will change, that will also pose a risk to the biodiversity. Biodiversity risk loss, for example, I mean, it's already projected to lead to decreases in crop yields of quite significant scale. And this is problematic, and you can say, if we solve climate change, then we will be fine also on biodiversity. But no, because there are also many other things in climate change that are posing risk to biodiversity. One could be the use of pesticides, others are pollution. Pollution is another environmental risk that we would like to see considered in this systemic approach. Pollution is again projected to today lead to an estimate of 9 million premature deaths worthwhile, 3 times more than from AIDS and tuberculosis and malaria. And this is again, I mean, this is posing risks that also are going to have not only, of course, huge social and human impacts, but also economic impacts. And finally, just to mention that we also work on circular economy, because we see half of the greenhouse gas emissions, and actually more than 90% of all the biodiversity loss and water stress comes from resource extraction and processing. So if we don't work on that risk either, we're not going to solve the other issues. So as I already mentioned, we put out this major package now in April, and you can find all the documents on our web pages. But we have a lot more in the planning for 2021. So we are planning and working on right now. In the second half of June, we will come out with a renewed sustainable finance strategy, where we will take stock both of what we have delivered so far, but also look again ahead. And then there's a number of important things coming up in autumn. There's also the Convention on Climate Change, is the UN Convention on Climate Change is meeting in November. But in the month of October, the Convention on Biological Diversity is also meeting. And it will be a very important issue for discussions between UN countries, how the whole sustainable finance agenda is moving more towards helping to solve these issues. We are then, as I mentioned, also working on the final pieces of the taxonomy. So we have now finalized the biggest or the first part on the more focused on the climate, but we will now move on to some of the other objectives. And then, as mentioned, we are working on this renewed sustainable finance strategy. You will hopefully, as I said, be seeing that towards the end of June. Just to mention again that the idea is really to step on all of the work done so far, but strengthen that. And then we are also increasingly looking at the interplay between financial markets and public investments, because what we have had to do also in the whole recovery work is, of course, to put our public money to good use in terms of ensuring that they're invested in the right way to ensure a green recovery. And we are increasingly looking at how they can be invested also to leverage the maximum private capital at the same time. Finally, we will continue on fully looking at how we manage the climate and environmental risks and taking that further. And then, because you also mentioned the G7, G20, I think indeed it's very, very important that that we keep a close connection between what we're doing inside the EU and what the rest of the world is doing right now. Financial markets are, of course, global. So at the time when we started all of this work, at the same time, we actually also set up an international platform on sustainable finance. And to begin with, it was really linked to some of those countries that we saw was starting to actively move in this area and who were keen to engage with us. We started with Argentina, Canada, Chile, China, India, Kenya. I think I have the whole, and Morocco in 2019. And since we have had other countries joining us, New Zealand, Indonesia, and so on and so forth. We see also a big increased interest now from the US and also from the UK. So this work will definitely also continue. The platform is really made, constructed in a way that it's for public authorities and a number of observers, as you see mentioned here, to share all the developments that are indeed moving very fast in different parts of the world. And that's really to try to align to the maximum to secure that our future legislations will be able to support and underpin each other, because we are all aiming at the end at solving the same issues. Thank you very much. I will stop my presentation here.
Excellent. You were on time. I mean, we feel safe that you work for us in the European Commission. You know, you keep the time. So to the audience, please, if you have questions, I see some questions, but also to Astrid, if you have any questions after the end of her presentation.
And unfortunately, we cannot take that away from the asset owners and asset managers, and everybody needs to go through that. So as such, no, I'm not concerned as long as I know why there is no correlation, right? Hope that helps.
Okay, so let me now switch to Mr. Skiadopoulos. There are a couple of questions, I guess, that are addressed to you. The first one, you use textual analysis, which is in fashion too, among academics. over the last few years. But textual analysis, is it the only way forward to quantify climate change risks? Someone asks. And then another one continues on a different type of question and says, have you performed any out-of-sample validation tests on the text-based factors? For example, are they purely backward-looking as news-based measures, or do they actually predict future firm-level failures and disasters? So I guess both questions are at the heart of your methodology, George.
Thanks, Gikas. Thanks for the questions. Regarding the first question, yes, we think that textual analysis is a natural approach to quantifying climate risks, because climate risks are multifaceted. So especially the method that we're using is a natural candidate to decompose climate risks in its various dimensions. And the beauty of the method, actually, in general, using textual analysis, is that it provides you with real-time measures, in contrast to ESG ratings typically provided, at least the ones that I know, which in most of the cases have very low frequency. So typically an investor is going to rely on ESG ratings published, on an annual basis, but she may have to take decisions, much faster. So textual analysis provides real-time measures. Regarding the second question, there is no backward-looking bias, if you wish, in this construction. May I emphasize that the ones that I show are market-wide climate risks. So there are actually studies which conduct textual analysis at a firm level, and they construct firm-level climate measures. Having said this, of course, the firms have a climate beta with respect to our factors. So, and the interesting thing, actually, and this relates actually, to the other talks, is that what we find is that the investors, when they hedge these climate risks by buying stocks, they do not buy the stocks of the green firms. Instead, they buy stocks of brown firms, which nevertheless show a good intention to become greener. So they do not look at the actual level of the E-score, but they look at the delta of the E-score. That's very interesting.
Interesting. I have some other, I guess, a question that perhaps is addressed to everybody, and perhaps Astrid can take a first crack at this answer. And it's kind of general. This is by Sofia Papastefano, who is asking the question. What is your view on carbon pricing as an effective instrument in reducing emissions? So she goes directly to the pricing issue that we economists think about. And what should the price of carbon be in order to adequately capture the externalities created by GHG emissions? Each one of you, if you want to have, but please, Astrid, since you're in the new commission, and you're next to the money, so you're thinking about pricing.
Well, I mean, if you look at the overall money in the world, the public budgets are still, a fraction. So whether I'm next to them or not, but I think this is a really great question, and it allows us to come a bit back to what George was also putting in his concluding remarks, or his concluding slide, which is, I mean, that we are here talking about a lot of disclosure of information and awareness raising and all kind of things, because we have not managed to get the market prices right. I mean, we have been talking about getting the market prices right for 100 years, since a well-known economics Professor Pigou wrote an article and talked about internalizing externalities. But if we look, we have not managed to crack that nut. And I think this is really, you know, essential. It's not the topic for this conference to discuss taxation, and taxation is not the only way to internalize some of these risks into the cost, and many of the other regulations we're putting in place are also helping, but they're not enough. And we've seen that in particular on the carbon price, which to my great satisfaction has risen in recent times, but we're not there yet where it is enough. And it comes back to something Claudia also said about, there is of course all the interactions about how are the companies impacting on the world, and then there is how the world is impacting on the companies. And the factoring risk into the investment decisions should preferably look at both, because else the risk either way will just grow and it will be a disaster for all of us. So that's how I would start.
Excellent. I have here a very specific question, I think, for Astrid, which asks, can the EU ensure that the CSRD will be applied with no delays by listed companies in different EU member countries in order to support investment firms' disclosures under the SFDR and EU taxonomy regulations? So this is...
Yeah, well, it sounds more like an encouragement, and which I appreciate. What we will have to do, of course, is that we are only at the stage where the European Commission has put forward this proposal, but the proposal still has to be agreed, and that will require negotiations with the member states of the EU and with the European Parliament. So I can only encourage anybody who would like to see this directive to be put in place and implemented as soon as possible to call for that, because I think it will be very important. And it's true that with these discussions we're having today, this sort of comparable company level information is actually very, very much needed. So we need to get that right without delay. I also think, coming back still on this pricing issue, that if you see what I presented about all the other environmental risks that I think are actually also quite worrying, but you could say that the little pulse of the carbon price, even if it was in the beginning limited, at least it evoked an interest in financial markets. So far, we have no price on the other environmental externalities. And so hence, we also see that financial markets are not starting so keenly to look at them yet. But we will get there. I'm convinced we have to. As Claudia says, there's no other way.
I guess one final question, and we wrap it up because we're running out of time. I understand due to COVID, finally Europe is getting together and actually spending money on getting out of the crisis. And the way the money is spent, part of it is like on green investing, correct? Do you feel this is a boost to what you do in the Commission that's going to make a difference in Europe over the next 5 years?
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. I think this is very, very important. However, if one is taking it from the more pessimistic angle, as something that I think it was George who also said, that what is interesting is also that you have this sort of classical, what we call pure green things that you just know are good and green and they have existed for a long time and so on. But actually, just investing in those is not going to bring the change about that we need. We actually need to engage and work with the bigger, more traditional, more polluting industries, because it's their type of production that has to be turned around. If we want to more than just feel good about our investments, but actually put our money towards where the problems lie. But I think I believe that this public money and the recovery money is extremely important. However, I looked a lot at the experiences learned from the 2008 crisis. And when you look at the end of the day, even if it sounds like it is big numbers, but still it represents a small splash, green splash into a big gray economy. So you also need to work on the frameworks, and the taxation, again, as I mentioned, is really a key issue, and member states need to do more on that.
Well, with this, let me thank our panelists. Thank you very much. We all learned a lot, and I guess, George, we're moving to the next session, right? So I pass it on to you.